Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering.
On this episode, I sit down with Daniel Lee, who is the CFO at DBT Labs. We often get questions from the DBT community, how does data work at our organization? Because it's clearly at the heart of everything we do. Daniel saw a lot of potential for how DBT could help his finance and operations teams and decided to do things a bit differently. A lot of our revenue recognition, accounting, and headcount planning all run through and is operationalized with DBT models. And on this episode, Daniel shares a bit more about what pain finance and operation leaders regularly deal with and how he automated some of the tedium away with an initiative we call internally DBT Labs on DBT. This is a great episode for practitioners looking to grow their impact and for finance and ops leaders looking to better partner with their data teams. And without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so we have a super exciting guest today, Daniel Lee, who's the CFO at DBT Labs. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Julia. Happy to be here.
This is fun since Daniel and I work together a lot, and it's exciting to have him as a guest on the show. So why do we have Daniel on the show? He joined DBT Labs a couple years back, and he did some really interesting work at DBT Labs around data. And often we have our community and customers, they always want to learn best practices. They always ask us, well, how do you do things differently at DBT Labs with data? And I figured it'd be a really interesting episode to bring Daniel on, who has a finance background, and talk a little bit more about how he brought DBT into some of the operations and finance work that we do here. But before we jump into that, I wanted to get to know Daniel a little bit more. So Daniel built a career in corporate finance at really exciting companies like Zoom and Okta. But I really love your story about why DBT Labs. Why are you here? So tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got here.
So my career actually didn't really start in finance. It started actually in operations. My first gig at a college was being part of the Kinko's team that got acquired by FedEx. And so I got to work in the stores and got to observe high performing stores, low performing stores, and sharing some of those key takeaways there. And it was great. You actually get to work in the store, you get to talk to customers, you get to understand what these people do. And Kinko's was an interesting culture in which people had been there for a very long time. So people would progress up throughout their entire career. And so I was part of that. And then I moved to a company called TiVo. TiVo invented the DVR. And it was great. I got to go and basically launch their B2B business from zero to a couple million in less than 2 years. And I learned a lot there, and I wanted to then get into finance because that was what I majored in. So I applied and I got a job at a company called KLA Tencor. It's now called KLA. It's a semiconductor capital equipment company. So for those of you that have been following semi over the past 5+ years, it's this sexy industry now that is growing incredibly well, especially with AI and self-driving and machine learning and all of that. But when I joined, it was sort of this old company that had been around for a long, long time. But the cool thing about those companies is that in order to survive, they had to be very lean and very efficient. So I learned how to run a business. I mean, running hardware with shipping and inventory and taxes and relocating our headquarters from the US to overseas at that time was a lot of interesting work. And, I learned a lot there. And then I went to Applied Materials, which is the bigger company within that space. Learned a lot there. Was in semi for close to 9+ years. And then I said, you know what? I need to do something different. I need to diversify my background a little bit. So I ended up going to a company called Rocket Fuel, which was an ad tech company that had just gone public, I would say 1 to 2 quarters prior to me joining. Long story short, the company had gone through some challenges and there was a lot of changes. I think I had over 5 different CFOs when I was there. So I learned how to pivot and how to adapt, and I would take on additional roles. And I also recruited some of my team from my previous company. So I ended up figuring out how we can shape things and change things. But towards the end, the company ended up getting bought at a fairly bargain basement price, if you will. And then I ended up going to Okta. So I joined Okta pre-IPO. I was part of the FP&A team there, learned SaaS, learned how to take a company public, was part of that IPO, continue to help them scale. And then I got recruited to Zoom. I joined when Zoom was fairly small, and there was a team of one analyst when I took over FP&A. Ended up taking over a combination of different roles, did not just FP&A, but took over a combination of ops, scaled their offshore team from 0 to a couple thousand, and then helped them scale from pre-IPO to IPO, and then pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. And then I got recruited to DBT Labs. And one of the things that excited me about joining DBT Labs was the value proposition and the problems that the company is solving. And this is something that I've been looking for throughout my entire career. For someone that was in operations and finance and having to comb through data and analysis, it was fairly normal when I was at KLA Tencor and Applied Materials to run a brand new analysis and only have 30 to 40% of the data, because the transformation that I was doing was fairly manual. In the pre-DBT world, I would have to work with somebody on the data team and the IT team, and then they would copy and paste the data. And then myself and my analysts would have to do these manual transformations in this massive Excel file. And so making decisions off of 20 to 30% of your data was the best that we had. And we had to just go with it. So once I realized what DBT can do and the access to all of our data and the standardization of what transformation is all about, that was what excited me about DBT.
Yeah, I really like your background because it shows you've just had such a diverse set of experiences, starting from Kinko's and physical stores through hardware, semis, finally to internet, and then software. And it's funny how you paint the story and why it's so important, because operations really, really matter when margins are low. That's your area of excellence, where if you get those things wrong, you don't have a business. And so you get really good at them because you have to by necessity. And it really shows some of your background here at DBT Labs, because you are our CFO, but you're definitely not just in spreadsheets. You're making some operational changes here as well. And so DBT Labs is my first company. So I don't always have a picture of what it's like to work with data at different companies. I just get the good experience that we have here, self-serve, where if I have questions to ask about my data, I can help myself most of the time. Was that very different in past roles, or what was it like on the finance team doing some of the operational work that you have to do at, say, Zoom or Okta, or maybe a past company that was really hard?
When I first left, hardware, and then I left ad tech, and then I went to SaaS, everyone was like, SaaS is new and it's difficult and all of that. And then I was like, okay, what's difficult about SaaS? And they're like, well, you have to know gross retention, net retention. You have to do cohort analysis. I mean, look at every single SaaS company, look at their S1. What are the three metrics? Gross, nets, churn, which is a variable of the above. And then you then have cohort analysis, right? Basically, what is the lifetime value of a customer over X amount of time? So there's that bar chart that every banker would have you put together. But the reality is that getting that data would require you to download your source data or your customer data. And then historically, finance, what we would have to do is we'd have to do it via spreadsheets, right? We would have to get it from the source. And sometimes the source is not fully accurate because customers, or a definition of a customer, is different depending on what source system that you use. And so having to reconcile that, and then having to then build these cohort analysis in this massive Excel file that would typically freeze or break. And, at Okta, we did that. At Zoom, we had a data team, but I would partner with the data team, and we would have to get the data out of Redshift. And then they would have to write these manual queries. And depending on which analysts I had, Derek Wing, I'm going to call him out. Derek was one of the analysts that we worked with, and he was dedicated to supporting me. And so, Derek was one of the early data science folks at Zoom, and he kind of helped me build these cohorts analysis. And then we would then finally get into a system. And then when a pipeline would change or some data set would change, it would break. And then it would take a couple of days to reconcile that. And so even leading up to the IPO, we would have to do our S1s, and we're like, okay, we're about to go public, and now we're a public company. We actually have to do it in a consistent way. It would break every so often. And as data analysts would rotate to different areas of the business, getting it in a consistent, scalable way was very challenging. And so I had Mark Matucci, who was my go-to-market FP&A person. He would then learn SQL himself and partner with the data team to figure out how to do self-service. And so he would have to write these long queries And luckily, Mark's background was data. So we were able to figure out how to scale that. But every time something breaks, it would take a couple of days for us to figure that out. And so as our data team scaled at Zoom, it got even more complex. And, as the business would grow, when we try to do the analysis ourselves in Excel, it would break because Zoom grew from a couple million to hundreds of millions of users. And it ended up breaking our Excel files. Some of our query would have to change. And so doing that in a repeatable, consistent way was virtually impossible.
Yeah. When you joined DBT Labs, I loved the enthusiasm that you had for the DBT product, because whenever you would tell anyone like why it was so amazing or so exceptional, you really talked about it, like how it solved your problem. You're like, I can close the book so much faster. It can help you be SOX compliant really quickly. Like that's what DBT does.
Yes.
And that's like not how other people describe what DBT does. But for you, you were like, this is going to help our team do our work so much better. So maybe tell us a little bit about when you showed up at DBT Labs, what this big initiative that you took on that we call internally DBT Labs on DBT.
I am someone that needs to apply problems that I understand. If I'm solving a problem that's in product, I can kind of understand it, but unless I'm in it, it's hard for me to actually connect the dots. I've always been very interested in doing things that no one else has done. Like for example, when I was at TiVo, I was one of the few people that actually had access to our live database, which was our access tables. And so I would write queries and I would learn SQL myself. And so I've always been very hands-on. And so one of the things that I loved about DBT was that when I joined, actually, when I first met Tristan, the first thing he did was he pulled up Looker and he was like, okay, these are our metrics. I was like, whoa, okay, so we have all of these things here. We then started to fine tune our metrics, but it was readily available and it was done in a very clean and consistent way. And I was like, okay, this is amazing. Like this solves a lot of problems that I was dealing with at every company that I've been at. But we were using it for other things outside of my team. And every company that I've been at, headcount has always been a problem and was a problem here in the sense that if I talked to the people team, they would have a different definition. And even depends on who I talk to within the people team. If I talk to a recruiter, they may think about offers accepted. If I talk to an HR business partner, they may think about people that are in seats. And then if I talk to someone else, they may think of people that are expected to be here that haven't resigned yet, right? And so it's like, it's different. And then you talk to finance, it's like, we care about people that are costing us money. And so that could exclude people that are on leave when on the people side, they're still employees because they're here, right? And so having a consistent definition has always been a pain point. And then having to connect all of that would require a lot of manual intervention between all these different teams. And so I said, how do I solve headcount? It's something that should be simple. Headcount is not something that I can't touch. Like I know people, right? And like you can see people.
Put names. Yeah, we're like 400 people.
Put a face to a name, but it shouldn't be hard. But I can tell you every finance leader that I've interacted with, myself over 20 years, we could not get headcount right. KJ, if you're listening, KJ was the head of people at Okta. Brett is now the CFO at Okta. Both Brett, myself, and KJ would have some challenges with defining headcount in a very consistent way. And so I said, okay, team, let's leverage DBT to help solve headcount. And we were able to do that. We now have consistent headcount reporting. We can cut it in multiple dimensions, many different ways, but the underlying data is the same. And with our semantic layer, that's incredible because we can have all the different data sources, but the definition is consistent. And so we were able to solve that. And once we were able to solve headcount, I said, let's continue to bring in processes that we're doing manually in other areas. Then that led us to revenue recognition. And now we're looking into accruals. And so one of DBT's core values is what we call moving up the stack. And that value resonates with me because throughout my entire career, regardless of whether I knew I was doing it or not, I've always tried to move up the stack. My first job in finance, when I joined KLA Tencor, our applications revenue, I was helping to support our applications team, which was a smaller business unit at that time. Dave Peters, who was running the overall team, one of his focus was automation. And so something that would take my predecessor a couple of weeks, I joined the company and I said, now I know why nobody really lasted in this role very long, because this manual process would take a couple of weeks. And so myself and Alan Roth at that time, him and I worked together to help automate. And essentially I ended up working myself out of a job. What would take 3 weeks now only took 2 hours, and then eventually it only took 30 minutes. And so then we then continue to just automate everywhere. And that's how I've always thought about things.
Yeah, I think it really is a testament to your background in operations and how do you make things more efficient. And so you saw this unlock something that was seemingly simple, really ended up needing to be asked to 4 different teams around headcount or revenue recognition, which count the revenue. Shouldn't be that difficult. And yet it lived in lots of different systems and you couldn't get a real source of truth. And one of the amazing parts about the modern data ecosystem is you just put all that data in your cloud data warehouse and you can have a consistent definition within dbt. So that way everyone understands not only what is the answer, but like, how did you get to the answer? How's documentation? And you have a real source of truth that didn't exist before. And what I like about what you've really done on the finance team is you've operationalized it. I think a lot of people talk about the hierarchy of needs in data. And the first thing is like visibility and reporting. So you got that when you had your first conversation with Tristan, like, show me the data, but now you're moving up the stack and operationalizing it. Did you get any pushback from the team? Like, because you ask a lot from your teams to work differently. And sometimes people don't always see the end of these efforts. Yes, when you get to the promised land, the automation will be great, but the journey from here to there might look a little fuzzy. How did your team react to wanting to do RevRec in DBT?
My team can attest. Let's just say accounting and finance people, when it comes to revenue, they're very conservative, rightfully so. You do not want to get revenue wrong, because if you get revenue wrong, it's a difference of a significant hit in terms of your market cap. Every public company CFO can attest that you do not want to get earnings wrong. And so there's a lot of people that are used to what they've always done, right? And so I've always had the mindset that, what has gotten us here doesn't necessarily get us to where we have to go. Some things do. Some things are tried and true. I'm a huge fan of New York pizza. It's great. Let's not mess it up. So my finance and accounting team, they're very conservative, but they also know how I am when it comes to innovation. And so we have this amazing tool in front of us. We have the tool that does testing and documentation, and you can actually run a query and actually see the results. And it's like all the things that finance and accounting people dream of. It's right in front of us. So how do we be creative and be thoughtful about what we use our own product for, right? And so it worked with headcount. I said, it has to work with revenue. And the alternative today was an Excel file. I truly believe, and it's true now, like anything we can do in Excel, we can do in DBT and then some. So the data team partnered with our accounting team, and we did it in 3 weeks. Big shout out to Ian on the data team. He partnered with our revenue accounting team, and they worked together and they made it happen. And I think during our first month, we were only off by like 3,000 or some type of number, 3,000 or 4,000. It was like ridiculously small.
Yeah, but we won't say what percentage of total revenue that is.
It's a very, very small
Tiny.
percentage. Yes. And I remember looking at it and saying, wow, this is like our first pass. And then it got to a couple hundred. And now we've been doing it for the past 6+ months. And I just got wind. So one of my goals was, how do we close the books in a timely manner? And the reason why most finance leaders want to close the books is because you want to just look forward. Closing the books is looking backwards on a month that just had passed. And so the sooner you can close, the sooner you can move forward and look forward to help supporting your business grow, because you can't change the past. And so first they were hesitant, but then once we saw the results and we saw how fast we were able to implement it, and then we saw how accurate it was, and then now we're doing it. Over time, it becomes second nature. Now we trust headcount, we trust revenue, and then we'll continue to add new additional workflows. Benepass, one of our applications for our benefits here, is now done in an automated way. And there's plenty of workloads that will continue to leverage the data warehouse and DBT on.
This October, join data practitioners at Coalesce, the analytics engineering conference hosted by DBT Labs. It's built by data people for data people. Register at coalesce.getdbt.com with the discount code podcast23, just for our listeners. That's podcast23 with a capital P. We'll see you there. You're in an interesting seat as CFO. You're leading the company through what has been choppier economic waters than in the past, and you really lean on data to help you navigate. But, most of our listeners here, they're on data teams and maybe they have to partner with finance teams or other business stakeholders. Like, what advice would you give to a data leader in how they can work best with their CFO and finance team at their respective companies?
I'm starting to see the role of the CFO continue to evolve, right? In the past, it was purely on, just finance, accounting, auditing, which is great. You have to nail the basic foundation. In my role here, it's a little bit broad. I own operations, people, legal, security, IT, and then obviously more recently anyway, the data team as well. And so I've always seen myself as somebody that is here to help the business and to help solve problems. I don't limit myself within my own role. When you look at my role at Zoom, Kelly, Zoom's current CFO, she allowed me to get into different areas, right? Rather than just doing purely FP&A, our team would own quotas and we would do both the bottoms up and tops down bookings plan and partner with the go-to-market leaders on those types of analysis. And I get to partner with Hillary, who's our sales ops leader at that time. And then I got into our offshore team, and I also ran our procurement team and partnered with our AWS and data center teams, right? So I've always had the mindset of, how do I help solve problems across the company? And how do you not just limit yourself within your current scope? And so if I'm a data leader, I know that data is extremely important to make business decisions. And I think that every role that I've had, I've always reevaluated what I've done every single quarter. Quarter ends, I look back and I say, what are my key accomplishments? Have I gotten better? There's a book that I read, can't think of the name right now, but there's many of these books out there. But, it's one of those things where if you don't look back at yourself 10 years ago and cringe a little bit, a lot of my friends have known me for a long time. So some of you may be listening, but I look back at myself 10 plus years ago and I cringe a little bit because I'm no longer the person that I was, but I feel like I've grown and I've adapted a lot. And, that's how I always think about things, right? I've been at DBT Labs for a little bit under 2 years. We didn't have a lot of these teams that were under me. And I've been grateful to be able to bring on some amazing leaders on my teams. And we've been able to continue to build a great foundation and a great team. We have to nail our basics, obviously, but how do you make sure that you continue to solve business problems? And no matter what role you're in, whether you're in data, whether you're in product, whether you're in engineering, you should operate as a business partner in the sense that you have key stakeholders that you work with, unless you're like very technical and you're in a very narrow focus, but generally you have to interact with more people. And so how do you make people's lives easier? How do you solve complex problems for the company? But most importantly, how do you continuously improve yourself and the people around you on a consistent basis? That's key.
So maybe share a little bit about the pod structure that you just rolled out, because I think that's really your advice is like never just think about your own role in a narrow way, but you're here to solve problems in the finance team. You're here to solve problems in the data team to help the business in whatever they need to do. But like structurally, what does that look like?
We want finance, ops, and data to be fairly aligned. And more recently, we're rolling out this pod structure where we have folks dedicated to supporting a section of the business. So we have a go-to-market pod, we have a engineering product and design pod, we then have a G&A pod. We were exploring a couple of different options. We were thinking about, do we do a type of a round robin and have folks within data rotate around? But we realized that having business context and getting to know your business partners deeply and being involved in that specific team on a consistent basis will allow your technical skills to actually drive value and, business problems and solutions. So we are trying out this pod structure where we have folks dedicated to a certain line of business. They'll then partner closely with their key stakeholders and they'll learn the business. I've always believed that learning the business is just as important as technical skills. Folks can be the most technical, but if they don't fully understand their business stakeholders' needs and they don't understand the business problem, it'll only take you half the way there. And so how do you constantly push yourself and learn new things? And we're trying this out. And, this is something that I'm very excited about.
Yeah, I think that's like a big part of the mission of DBT. It's not the skill of DBT is not alone exciting. It's only exciting when you use it to do something useful for the business. And so bringing more people along for that journey,
Yep.
lowering the bar for like how difficult it is to do traditional data engineering work and getting data and the business as closely aligned as possible is what we're all about. But it's really not just tech. It's also organizational structure and how do you set up people to be aligned to work towards that goal. So the pod structure seems to work well.
Yep. I'm excited. I'm always thinking about doing new things because technology is evolving so quickly that things that have worked 5+ years ago is constantly up for change. So we have to embrace that.
We've had some other guests on the podcast in the past where we've had the debate around whether data teams, some of the benefits and negatives of having data teams report into finance or report into maybe the EPD leadership. What would you say is one of the biggest benefits of data being aligned really closely with finance?
I don't know if there's a perfect formula, in terms of, whether it should sit with EPD or finance, but I just know that every company that I've been at, finance or the way I've operated in terms of partnering with ops and data, I always felt that I partnered fairly closely with the data team. And I think maybe it's because of my background. Early on in my career, I would be one of the few people that would actually partner and have access to our data. And so I've always felt that data was extremely important to have insights in terms of running the business. And as somebody that has led finance teams and continues to lead finance team, we actually do a lot of the analytics. And so I always felt that the roles and responsibility of the data team closely aligns with my finance team, and making sure that we're all marching in the right direction has always been beneficial. Where I've seen it not work is when there's different priorities and different direction, and you never want your finance and ops and data teams to be operating in silos, because ultimately we're all working to help solve problems across the business. And similar to how we centralize headcount and now we're doing revenue, we want everybody to be looking at things the same way. And so I think that in a world in which I've always been operationally and data focused, aligning with finance here was just a natural progression of what I've done throughout my entire career.
Yeah. If I were to summarize, you really view finance and data as kind of stewards and supporters of the business unit, and you need to make sure that they're aligned with each other so that they can row in the same direction and really force multiply their impact for all the other functions within the organization, solve problems together. This has been a lot of fun. I'm going to ask our final wrap-up question that we ask all our guests, but looking 10 years out, what do you hope will be true for the data industry?
I don't know if it's hope. I see it and I breathe it every day, but I would say that we're barely scratching the surface of all the different use cases that we can do with data. I think we've graduated from a phase in which we can store the data and then let's do some analysis. But I would say that the analysis that we're doing with data is fairly basic today. You talk to finance teams today, they have some access to the data and they're running analysis, but I think folks are doing some basic analytics. I see a world in which there's real-time analysis where we're asked to make decisions faster than we've ever done before. Just 15 years ago when I was at K-Lane Hencor, I was pulling data that was a couple of months old, only had a small percentage of the data, and then I was making forward-looking decisions off of that. Now we're in a world where we can actually feed all the data in there, and then we're leveraging DBT to actually explore what we can do. But I feel like we're in the early innings of all the different use cases. And, there's a lot of finance teams that are still doing things in a manual way. One of our goals is how do we continue to speed up our close? We close in 6 business days this month. Big shout out to the finance.
Put that on a shirt.
We actually improved our close this month to 5 days. And, my goal is to get it to, 1 to 2 days over time. And I don't think I've been at a company leading up to an IPO that has done it in that timeline. And I feel like that should be a baseline going forwards. And then that'll allow us to support the business and innovate even faster. So we're super early.
Moving up the stack. I love it. That's what you always try to do. Well, Daniel, it's been super fun having you on the show. I'm glad we were able to talk a little bit more about how finance and data teams work together. And hopefully someone will learn something interesting to share with their finance leaders at their companies.
Thank you so much, Julia.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs and is hosted by Tristan Handy and myself, Julia Schottenstein. Have comments, questions, or guest suggestions? Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com. Our producers are Jeff Fox and Dan Poppy. If you enjoy the show, please drop a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.